The scent of cardboard dust and fresh paint curled through the little apartment like the first deep breath after holding your head under water too long. Lila Hart stood in the center of her new place in Maplebridge, a modest two-room nest perched above a quiet street lined with sugar maples and creaky porches. Towers of moving boxes surrounded her like battlements, each marker-scrawled label a chiming bell of possibility. Kitchen, winter sweaters, paperbacks, photo albums she hadn't dared to open in years. A smile tugged at her mouth, a weary, triumphant thing that felt almost defiant. She'd done it. She had finally stepped out of the shadow and into herself, out of a relationship that had pressed her into a smaller version of her own body, that had dimmed her laughter and turned every decision into an argument she was destined to lose. She could still hear the quiet, condescending bite of his voice. Cole had a way of making her feel like a child, even when she was dead certain about who she was. Not anymore. Not here. She walked to the single wide window and drew back the sheer curtain with a fluttering breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Outside, the view wasn't a skyline or anything a travel blogger would rush to capture. It was better. The sunlight fell across a narrow, slightly wild strip of green out back, fenced in by leaning slats and overtaken by dandelions and clover. Her own little garden, a world of humble, stubborn life pushing through the dirt. A robin hopped along the fence rail, cocked its head at her as if to say, "Well, what will you plant?" Lila pressed her palm to the cool glass and let the reality soak into her bones. This was the first place on the planet that was wholly, quietly, hers. A bubble of giddy excitement fizzed up inside her chest, so fizzy she almost laughed out loud. For the first time in forever, she was unafraid to hope. She had to tell someone. Had to hear her joy in another person's voice so it would feel real. She dug her phone from a tote bag overflowing with bookmarks and tea tins and rogue pens and perched it on a box labeled Fragile. Her thumbs flew. She fired off a text to her best friend, the one who had given her the spare room and the steely pep talks when she needed them most. "Maya, I'm here. I'm finally here. New address and all. It's small, but it's mine. Wish me luck." She snapped a quick picture of the garden, blurry, crooked, the light catching on dust motes, and attached it with little fireworks popping in her pulse. She didn't notice that her phone had pulled up an old Maya from her contacts, a number saved from some long-ago nonprofit gala where she'd poured coffee and thanked donors. A handshake that lasted a second and then evaporated. Predictive text made a decision for her without asking. She was too tired and too happy to notice the tiny betrayal. Across the river in Riverton, in a glass and steel penthouse that hovered above the city like a crystal terrarium, Beckett Vale read the message. He'd come home late from a day that felt endless and hollow at the same time. Back-to-back meetings, the kind where people wore their best sincerity and their most polished agendas. They wanted an intro, a signature, a yes that would cost him 10 future no's. A little chunk of his life to treat like an inexhaustible resource. Beckett wasn't naive about who he was in their eyes. He was a lever they could pull, the name that opened doors and conjured influence, the check that made other checks appear. He'd built Vale Dominion from a dorm room idea and 2 friends who'd believed in him harder than he believed in himself. Now he existed at a height where everything was sleek and nothing felt like it had a heartbeat. He was exhausted, not from the negotiations or the jet lag of his own calendar, but from wearing the armor all day long, the competent, unbothered expression, the perfectly curated silence between words. He poured himself water, felt the cold in his palm, and then his phone chimed with a message from an unknown number. He read it once, then again. He stared at the little garden in the photo, a mess of Eden, sunlit and imperfect. He let the words linger in the quiet, sterile air. "I'm finally here." It was silly, meaningless data from a stranger, and yet something loosened inside him, a tiny knot behind his ribs he hadn't noticed, a long dormant muscle twitching awake. The message carried something he almost didn't recognize anymore. It wasn't a request or a pitch. It wasn't dressed up. It was hope. It smelled like rain on hot concrete after a drought. He closed his eyes and, for a moment, Imagined the weight of a key in his own hand. Imagined stepping over a threshold and being allowed to exhale. His first instinct, well-honed and automatic, was to ignore it. Delete. His second was to reply with a simple, clipped, wrong number and go back to the emails, the spreadsheets, the unslept-in bed waiting in the other room. He did neither. Instead, he let curiosity, careless, unscripted, unbillable hours, turn him towards something unexpected. The address metadata tucked in with the photo was right there, a pulse of coordinates. He tapped it. A small, unassuming neighborhood in Maplebridge popped onto his screen, a part of town he'd never driven through and would never have had a reason to. He stared out at the city lights stitched across the dark and then looked back down at the little patch of green that had somehow pulled air into his lungs. The next morning, Beckett Vale sat behind the wheel of a car that belonged in glossy magazines more than it belonged on the cracked streets of Maplebridge. A bouquet of wildflowers lay across the leather passenger seat, a cheerful, unruly mess of daisies, lavender sprigs, baby's breath, and cornflowers that nodded every time he took a corner. He didn't choose the polished roses pressed into formal mounds in five-star lobbies. He chose everything that grows wherever it wants. He told his assistant he needed an hour before diving into quarterly targets, then turned off his calendar notifications with a tiny thrill of rebellion duller men would never understand. He was driving toward a woman he had never met for a reason that couldn't be charted on any boardroom whiteboard. There was no logic he could present in a strategy deck. Something about the way her words sounded in his head made him brave enough to follow them. He had a ridiculous thought. Maybe if he saw the garden, he would understand why the message undid him. Lila was on the floor, waging war with a particularly stubborn box of books that had been repacked so many times the cardboard was going soft, when a knock sounded at her door. Not the impatient pounding she'd learned to dread, but firm and polite, a sound with manners. She froze, palms flat on Jane Eyre and a second-hand copy of The Secret History that smelled like someone's attic. She wasn't expecting anyone. Maya had promised to come on Saturday with a spare set of dishes and her opinionated cat, and the landlord had already handed over the keys with an absent-minded smile and a reminder to call if the sink leaked. Fear flared and then sputtered. She breathed through it like her therapist had taught her. The therapist who had told her no man's shadow lives in your new rooms unless you let it. She moved to the peephole and braced herself for nothing. What she saw made her blink. A tall man stood on the little square of carpet outside, dressed ridiculously well for a Tuesday in Maplebridge. Dark blazer, gray sweater that looked like it had been knit by angels, jeans that fit a body that knew gyms but didn't worship them, and in his hands, a bouquet of wildflowers. She slid the chain and opened the door a few inches, her shoulder still ready to slam it again. "Can I help you?" Her voice was even. She was proud of that. The man's smile started small, almost shy, and reached his eyes. They were a surprising, steady gray, the color of morning before the sun makes any promises. "I hope so," he said. His voice was a calm tide over pebbles. "I think you wished me luck." "Excuse me?" She blinked, utterly lost, and then he held up his phone. Her photo glowed on the screen, the crooked shot of the garden, her message beneath it, still wearing the little house emoji like a shy corsage. "This was you, right?" The truth hit her so hard, she actually swayed. A hot wash of mortification surged from her throat to the tips of her ears. She had sent her new address, her address, to a stranger. Not just any stranger, the kind of stranger who looked like he belonged on a magazine cover. Her first blazing instinct was to slam the door, toss her phone in the garbage, and go hide behind a tower of cookbooks until the earth unspooled. But then she looked at him again, into those steady eyes. There was no smirk there, no judgment lying in wait, just curiosity, something contained and gentle, like a secret he wasn't sure she wanted. Lila's laugh started as a small, startled puff and then burst out of her uncontrollably. She laughed at herself, at the absurdity of her life, at the fact that she couldn't even celebrate without the universe tossing in a twist. "Oh my God," she said, still laughing, which made her laugh harder because she laughed when she was embarrassed, and she was very embarrassed. She unlatched the chain and swung the door wider. I cannot believe I did that. I'm so sorry. I meant to text my friend and this is so ridiculous. I swear I'm not a crazy person. It's okay. The warm laugh lines deepened near his eyes, and something unspooled in his shoulders, as if her laughter had loosened him too. No apology necessary. It was the kindest message I received yesterday. He glanced down, held up the flowers like a peace offering, like proof he came on purpose. I'm Beckett, he said simply. And these are for your new home. The bouquet smelled like summer, like the roadside stands she'd loved growing up, like a childhood she wanted to believe wasn't lost after all. She took them, her fingers brush clinking against his. A tiny crackle ran up her arm that she refused to dignify with the word spark. He was handsome and kind, and she'd been bypassing kindness so long she barely knew what to do with it. I'm Lila. She looked past him at the hallway painted the color of tinned peaches, then back to the flowers in her hand, then up at him, her heart doing a thing that used to scare her and now made her feel brave. The least I can do is make you a terrible cup of instant coffee as an apology, she said, moving aside so he could step over the cardboard threshold into the mess of her new life. If you're brave enough. I'm braver than I look, he said. And that smile grew just enough to feel like a circuit had clicked closed. He stepped into the sea of boxes without fear of paper cuts or tripping over her future, and she closed the door behind him, the sound not a trap but a welcome. They sat on upturned moving boxes, the one labeled dishes and the one labeled scarves, sipping instant coffee from mismatched mugs she'd inherited from Maya's collection of pottery class fails. Around them, the room smelled of dust and paint and the faint echo of the life someone else had lived there. They talked like kids balancing on a low wall, careful at first, then giddy that they weren't falling. And somewhere in the sweetness of those early minutes, the stranger with the flowers, the librarian with the boxes, they stopped being absurd and started feeling inevitable. They didn't trade histories or resumes. Lila didn't tell him about coal and the way one person's slow drip of doubt could flood a house. Beckett didn't tell her how lonely a glass-walled life can feel, or how sometimes elevators make you feel like you're rising when really you're stuck. He only said, when she nudged about what he did, I invest in projects, a phrase so bland it covered everything and nothing at all. They talked about the library downtown, where the light made the dust look holy. They talked about how the first sip of tea can feel like a confession. They talked about places they wanted to go and the beauty of staying put. He listened the way she didn't think anyone listened anymore, to the words and the quiet between them, like she was saying something important even when she wasn't. He didn't stay long. He knew how to read a room. He could feel how her home needed her alone. But when he left, the echo of his laugh and the shape of that easy conversation lingered in the little apartment like the ghost of a song you keep humming hours later. 2 days later, a text pinged her phone while she was on a break at the Maple Bridge Public Library. You showed me your new home, Lila. Will you show me your favorite place in the city? His request was simple and direct, a hand held out. Against every self-protective thought she had taught herself to think, she said yes. She didn't take him to any place with a velvet rope or a price tag that made your tongue go dry. She led him into her world, which was stitched together with quiet wonders. They moved through the hush of the library where Lila worked, their footfalls a courtesy. She set her palm on a particular shelf like you might place a hand on a beloved's shoulder. First editions, she whispered, her voice full as if she were saying prayers. This one is a Frost signed by his daughter. This one survived a flood. She had that way, like a person who had taken a lifetime inventory and discarded everything that wasn't true. He looked at her, and it struck him, profoundly and unexpectedly, that he wanted to stand in the corner of her life and watch her do what she loved most. She took him after to a second-hand bookshop that smelled like newsprint and cinnamon gum, where the owner, Mr. Fenn, wore a knitted tie and asked after Lila's mother by name, even though Lila's mother had moved to Arizona 5 years ago to chase sunsets. Lila pulled a faded copy of The Velveteen Rabbit down and held it to her heart for a heartbeat, before smiling at him with a little shake of her head and tucking it back. They wandered to a tiny tea shop called Nettle and Steam that had room for 6, maybe 7 people if nobody breathed too deeply. The owner, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a softer laugh, served the best Earl Grey in the city, and Lila showed Beckett how to take it with a wedge of lemon without making the tea flinch. Through it all, he was unusually quiet for a man who led rooms for a living, drinking in the texture of her world, how connected every thread was, how Mr. Fenn waved at the tea shop owner through the window, how a teenager from the library stopped to tell Lila he'd finished the book she'd recommended and cried because of it. Beckett breathed it in the way a man breathes oxygen after too long at altitude, chest expanding greedily, desperate. They were stepping out of Nettle and Steam into sunlight that made the street look dipped in honey when a voice sliced through the afternoon, sharp and cold enough to ice the air. "Lila," it drawled. "Well, well, fancy seeing you here." She went still. It was strange how quickly the body remembered fear, even if the mind had sworn it off. Cole Mercer stood on the sidewalk, arms folded, his mouth tilted in that way he thought made him look smarter, like he knew something she didn't. Possession rolled off him like cologne. "Cole," she said, every warm thing in her tone freezing. "What are you doing here?" "Just grabbing a coffee." He sent a glance up and down Beckett, one swift predatory sweep, the way a person might skim a list of ingredients and decide he was allergic to all of them. He smiled, but it was a lie that didn't bother to try hard. "Who's your new friend?" "I thought you needed space." Space usually doesn't look like that. He tipped his chin at Beckett, implication slick and base. "You can't stand on your own, can you?" Shame and anger rose in Lila. Old twins she'd thought she'd outgrown. Her mouth opened to tell him to leave, to say no and mean it and not apologize for saying it. She was ready. But Beckett moved first. He didn't puff himself up or lean into a fight he'd win. He stepped a half pace forward, just enough to position himself between Lila and Cole. A subtle shift that rearranged the air. He didn't have to raise his voice to fill the space. "She's not alone," he said, quiet and steady. The authority in him, a thing you could lean against. Not anymore. His hand found the small of Lila's back, not claiming but grounding. Warmth from his palm seeped through her sweater, and that simple human contact after so long flung her back into her own body. "Come on, darling," he said, and the softness threaded through his voice turned her into a person who could let herself be guided away. He didn't even look at Cole again, as if the man was a piece of litter the wind would take care of. They walked away. Her heart beat fast, wild, but not with fear. It was the drumline of being defended, of being seen so completely she didn't have to raise her voice to be heard. On the walk back to her apartment, they didn't say anything at first. Some silences are charged with dread. This one hummed in her bones like the promise of rain, electric and strange. She could still feel the echo of his hand on her, like warmth left on a bench you've just risen from. Inside her little living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and books that had started arranging themselves into the beginning constellation of home, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said. It felt inadequate, but it was the truest thing. "No one has ever—" She stopped. Tears pricked and then retreated. "No one has ever stood between me and him like that. Or anyone and him. He had no right to speak to you that way." His gaze didn't waver, and the way he said it, flat with certainty, like gravity, made something inside her knit back together. He said it like it was obvious. It felt like someone had pulled her out of a deep pool. After that, a filament stretched taut and bright between them, something unnameable, yet impossible to ignore. They fell into a rhythm that made time less something to be endured and more something to be tasted. Saturday came warm and lazy, a day that made people forget their chores. They sat on a park bench beneath a canopy of spreading elms. Lila had a book open in her lap, but she kept reading the same paragraph and thinking instead about how it felt to be quiet next to someone. How intimacy could be built in silence like a house built with honest beams. With him, she recognized a safety she had been living without for so long she thought it was a myth. With her, Beckett's edges softened. It was as if the constant hum of engines he lived beside finally shut off for maintenance, and he was allowed to be a man sitting on a bench, reading. One of the kids from the swings put a dandelion in Lila's hand as if she had been ordained by the town to carry their small sons. She tucked it behind her ear. It felt ridiculous and joyful. She let herself keep it there. "That first day," she said eventually, keeping her eyes on the page as if that would make her less afraid to ask what she wanted. "When you showed up at my door with the flowers, you had this look, Beckett. Like you were very far away from yourself. Why did a stranger's accidental text make you drive across the river with a bouquet?" She looked up then. Curiosity and mercy mixed in equal measure. It took him a long breath to answer. He watched two little boys chase a soccer ball down the grass, their laughter the opposite of boardroom applause. His posture, normally easy enough to convince men twice his age to do what he wanted, tightened almost imperceptibly, like a string pulled taut. "The people in my world," he said quietly, choosing his words because words were what he had to make sense of a life like his, "don't really see me. They see the name, the money, the access. They do the math on what I can do for them the minute I shake their hand." He turned then, and she saw it. The hairline fracture in the cool surface of him, a little glimmer of the boy he might have been before he learned to build walls to size. "Your message." He smiled, but it was a small and sad thing. It wasn't asking for anything. It was a window I didn't know I missed, a view into a life that felt unperformed. You were excited. You weren't curating that excitement for anyone. I wanted to stand on a sidewalk where the light was honest. I wanted to see the garden. "And?" she asked softly, because she could tell he hadn't spent a lot of time saying out loud the things that lived under his ribs. "And being with you in your world feels like being seen. I don't even know how to say it without sounding like a cliché on a greeting card, but I feel like Beckett. Not Beckett Vale." He breathed out as if surrendering a secret he'd been made to carry too long. "It's been years since I felt that way." She was touched in a place in her chest she had kept braced and ready to run. It clicked into place then. They were both lonely, but in different rooms. He had been lonely while surrounded by people who wanted to sit next to him at dinners. She had been lonely beside one person who thought he owned the chair. "I don't want to mess this up, Lila," he whispered, the words almost catching in his throat. He looked at her like every good thing in him wanted to be kind. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not dramatic. It was the sort of kiss that asks permission while already knowing the answer. It tasted like hope tasted the first time you say it with your whole mouth. Like fear letting go of the doorknob. Like new. Lila closed her eyes and let the warmth of him, the humanity of him, soak into her. The world didn't stop. A dog barked, the soccer ball ricocheted off the bench leg. Life kept being life. But something shifted between them, pivoting from possibility to promise. Neither of them said it out loud, but a shadow hung at the edge of their new light. The truth of who Beckett was in the world, the engines his life ran on, the private jets the magazines wrote about. The fact that he would have to go back to boardrooms and headlines, and a life that wasn't built with mismatched mugs and Saturday quiet. That secret moved with them like a cloud, unable to rain yet. They didn't float off into a montage of kisses. They started building a small, real thing. He kept coming to Maplebridge. He left behind his glass cage for the chipped ceramics and soft sweaters of her life. He parked on her street in a car that looked like the future had gotten cocky, and knocked on her door with grocery bags from the farmer's market instead of catered meals. They browsed the library together. They took long walks without their phones, counting the herons on the river without saying their numbers. They cooked simple dinners in her little kitchen, the skillet a battlefield for eggs he always over-scrambled the first time. He never talked about work. She learned not to ask. Not because she was incurious, but because she wanted to protect what they were building from the weather outside. His life in Riverton was a sealed box, and for a while, she was willing to let it sit sealed on a shelf that wasn't hers. Bubbles, though, are beautiful and doomed by their nature. One Friday, as sun slanted through the trees and turned the street gold, Beckett's dark gray Aston Martin, so out of place among the rusted pickups and sensible sedans that it might as well have been a spaceship, coughed and then went dead 2 blocks from Lila's apartment. He swore under his breath and laughed at the same time, an odd sound that admitted the ridiculousness of his life. He called the local auto shop, Maple Bridge Motors, and within minutes a tow truck rumbled up, grease and goodwill rolling off it in equal measure. Hank, a grizzled, merry-eyed mechanic, popped the hood with a practiced flick, and while Beckett leaned in to look like a person who understood combustion engines, Hank's eyes dipped to the watch on his wrist. "Whoa, buddy," Hank said, low whistle sliding out. "That a Patek Philippe? Calatrava? My old boss in the city had one of those. That thing costs more than my whole garage." He grinned, not impressed in a gross way, but delighted. "You must be somebody." Beckett's smile tightened without meaning to. He was suddenly, viscerally aware of the thin air of his two worlds colliding. He forced a shrug. "Lucky investment," he said, easy as oil. "Deflect and move. Can you tow her over?" "I'll, take care of whatever she needs," he paid in cash before Hank could get his hands too dirty with forms, tipping more than the job required. Eager to shut the conversation down and drive the distance between who he was here and who he had to be there. Lila had walked over after his call to say he'd be late. She saw the way Beckett's shoulders went from relaxed to armored in a flicker. She clocked how he changed the temperature of the interaction by degrees until they were all the way back in Riverton and Maple Bridge had vanished like a stage set. Hank rumbled away with the Aston Martin strapped behind like a trophy, and Lila tucked the moment in her pocket for later. A tiny, discordant note in their song. They wandered past the town square, past the community bulletin board and the produce stand that sold tomatoes like summer in your mouth. A newsstand on the corner caught her eye, glossy covers screaming the drama of the world. She was scanning for the new issue of a literary magazine she liked when her blood froze. There, on the cover of a business journal, was a small author photo, a severe suit, clean-shaven jaw set like a verdict, eyes not soft or laughing but formidable, intimidating. The headline read, "Titans of Tech, the Innovators Shaping Our Future." Stock images of servers and cityscapes backed him like a kingdom. Beneath the photo, the name was clear and unarguable. Beckett Vale, CEO of Vale Dominion. Lila stopped walking. The world around her tilted a few degrees, enough to make her grab for a lamppost. She looked from the magazine to the man standing in a simple sweater beside her, to the magazine, to him again. "Beckett," she whispered. The last name got stuck in her throat. Beckett Vale. Her finger, suddenly treacherous, lifted and pointed at the glossy betrayal under fluorescent light. As she watched, the color drained from his face. The easy warmth that had become his default with her vanished, replaced by panic so raw it made him look years younger and far more lost. Their walk back to the apartment was a punishment. Words tangled and died as soon as they left his mouth. He kept trying, every sentence beginning with her name like a plea and trailing off into blank air. "Lila, Lila, please." Each fell and shattered. She let the silence grow because any words she would choose in that moment might turn into cuts she couldn't unmake. Inside, the door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like judgment. She turned away from him. She needed space between her and whatever this was. "I think you should go," she said, and her voice was flat as a table where you put things you're not ready to look at. He flinched. She had never seen Beckett flinch. "Please," he said, the desperation tearing his careful control to ribbons. "Just, let me talk." She shook her head. "Not right now." He went. The door clicked again, the sound ringing through her like a gavel pronouncing a sentence. The silence afterwards swallowed the little apartment like fog. Lila lowered herself to the couch slowly, as if moving too fast would shatter her. She knew what she had to do, and dreaded doing it. She opened her laptop, typed his name, and pressed enter. Articles exploded onto her screen, a tidal wave of information about a man she had been kissing and cooking eggs with. Beckett Vale, elusive billionaire behind Vale Dominion, the man who flipped stagnant companies into phoenixes, the leader with a reputation for surgical decisions and ironclad privacy. Photos from glittering galas, video clips from stages where he spoke to thousands with ease. A dozen profiles marveling at how little of his private life anyone knew. The pieces painted a life made of power and polished surfaces, and it was a life he had kept from her with meticulous care. The ache that speared through her was clean and mean. It wasn't about the money. Money had never been a thing that impressed or frightened her much. It was about the lie she had unknowingly agreed to live inside, the curation of a version of himself he'd brought to Maplebridge on weekends. The way he'd allowed her to love a sliver of the truth and told himself it was to protect her, when some part of her knew it had been to protect himself. Her mind, traitorous in its beautiful efficiency, flashed to Cole, his small lies that grew, the manipulation that wrapped itself around her until she couldn't tell where her own opinions lived. Had she really stumbled into the same trap again, this time with a bigger price tag and a better suit? Was she just a charming stopover on his way back to a life full of women with high cheekbones and rooms where the air smelled like power? The humiliation hit her so hard she had to put her head between her knees. A knock at the door made her jump. She knew who it was. She opened it because they had always met the truth head-on, and if he was going to lie now, she wanted to watch his face while he did it. Beckett stood there, panic carved into every line of him, the CEO from the magazine gone and replaced by the man who'd stood in her doorway with flowers and hope. "Lila," he said, her name broke in his mouth. "Please, let me explain." She stared at him, love and betrayal in a knot so tight she could hardly breathe through it. "Explain what, Beckett?" Her voice turned brittle so it wouldn't break. She had learned that, too. That you were ashamed of me? Or that I was a weekend hobby while you took a vacation from your real life? The way he physically recoiled at the word hobby was a small, vicious balm. She saw the pain light his eyes and hated that she could still care about his pain. "No." His voice went ragged. He stepped into her living room because she didn't stop him. He looked like desperation walking. "No, Lila. Never. It was never that." He took a breath and scrubbed a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd learned meant he was trying not to come apart. "Can I talk for 5 minutes?" She said nothing, and then her shoulders gave a small, bitter nod. He took it like a gift he'd never believed he deserved. She folded her arms over her chest, not to guard herself from him exactly, but to hold back the next wave of hurt. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "so many times, but I was a coward. I was afraid." She tilted her head, astonished, and then the sharp part of her found purchase. Afraid? The man who runs an empire was afraid of a librarian with a second-hand couch and a plant she can't keep alive? Sarcasm didn't fit her. It felt like putting on heels 2 sizes too small. She let it pinch him anyway. "I was afraid of this," he said, a little loud, gesturing to the open air between them, to the softness they had built, to the trust he was watching rot in his hands. "Afraid of the way your eyes would change when you looked at me. The moment I would stop being Beckett and start being Beckett Vale. I just wanted," he swallowed, "I wanted something real. I wanted to be sure that someone liked me, not the name, not the money. The man who gets lost on country roads because he refuses to use GPS. The one who reads the dedications in the front of books because sometimes they're better than the story." She had the jagged, ugly thought. "So you tested me. You didn't trust that I might be exactly who I said I was, not because I'm special, but because so many are. So you didn't trust me." Her voice fell into a dangerous stillness. "From the beginning, you assumed I would be like everyone else. You assumed the money would blind me the second I saw it. You made my choice for me before I could make it myself." She took a step toward him, the scales tipping. He wasn't the man with all the ground under his feet anymore. "Don't you see the irony?" she said softly but with a cut he felt, "that for someone so determined to escape the world of money, you're the only one who couldn't see past it. You were so busy looking for the trap in me that you set the biggest trap of all. You judged me so you wouldn't be judged." The words landed like a dropped suitcase at his feet. He had nothing to say, because she wasn't wrong. He had built an entire argument to justify his fear, and then handed her only the parts of himself he was willing to lose. He felt suddenly, viscerally, like a house stripped of furniture, empty rooms echoing. "You're right," he said. and when he looked up, his eyes were unguarded in a way she had never seen. The apology wasn't wrapped in defense, it was raw. My fear. My damage. I was cynical, and that cynicism is a brutality dressed in politeness. I hurt you. I insulted you. I am so sorry. The sincerity of it made something inside her lurch in the direction of forgiveness. But sincerity couldn't turn back a lie the same afternoon it was discovered. I don't know if I can trust someone who didn't trust me first, she said. The words felt like stones in her mouth, and yet she set them down between them anyway. Her heart pressed against her ribs, wanting what it wanted like a stubborn child. Too soon, too deep. She looked away from him to the little square of garden out the window, the place that had started all of this like a dare. I think you should go. He stood there for a beat too long, as if waiting for her to soften, to laugh, to say she didn't mean it. When she didn't, he turned and left. The door closed gently, and it sounded like the end of something she had been terrified to begin, and even more terrified to lose. He had everything in the world by the calculus of magazines and men, and he had just lost the only thing he'd found that made sense of all of it. He knew, with a sick knowledge in his gut, that his money was useless here. He would have traded it all for the right to stand on her porch with flowers again and be believed. Days blurred, color drained from things that had been bright. Lila moved through her routines as if they belonged to someone else. She stacked new books at the library, nodded hello to the regulars, corrected a teenager's research citation. She watered the little garden, her breaths a rhythm. The apartment felt larger without him in it, echoing in a new and lonely way. The ache sat in her chest constant and low, a fever that kept settling in her bones no matter how much tea she drank. She dreamed of him and woke with the impression of his hand on her back, the way he could take the air out of a room full of sharp people and soften it without breaking a sweat. She refused to Google him again. The last search had made her feel like she'd fallen through a trapdoor into a room lined with mirrors. Beckett, for his part, worked more hours than even he considered sane. The numbers flipped and the charts rose, but none of it arranged into meaning. The penthouse, once a quiet airplane hangar at the end of his days, felt like a mausoleum for a future he no longer wanted. He told himself to give her space, a phrase that felt like penance disguised as virtue. He lasted 3 days before the itch under his skin drove him out of his high-rise shell and back across the river. He made excuses. There was a meeting with a Riverton-based startup that needed shepherding, a donor he had to charm for a philanthropic initiative that had been collecting dust on his to-do list. He parked blocks away from Maple Bridge's Little Main Drag and walked it like a man hoping for a miracle without deserving one. He found one anyway. The Copper Cup, the town's main coffee shop, had wide windows that turned the afternoon sun into syrup. He saw her before she saw him, sitting by the window with a man who looked like he'd been born good, friendly, open smile, eyes that crinkled when he talked. They were leaning over a notebook, heads close, the kind of closeness that grows in happy conversations about things that matter. Lila laughed at something and tipped her face up for a moment, and Beckett had to lean against a lamppost because the sound knocked his balance clean out of him. He hadn't heard her laugh like that in weeks. He had made her stop laughing like that. The man was Evan Morris, a local author who spent so much time at the library he practically paid rent in overdue fines. He'd asked Lila to meet him to talk through research for his new historical novel. He was clearly smitten with her, the way good men show it. By listening so hard, their posture changes. Beckett knew the feeling well. Jealousy rose in him, so fast and hot and stupid he almost laughed at it, like a burn that made no sense and yet hurt all the same. He hated that he felt it. He had no right to. He also couldn't stand outside watching the man fall in love with Lila without his legs beginning to move without asking his permission. He pushed open the Copper Cup's door and the bell overhead chimed like a warning. The place quieted a notch as people sensed the air changed. He walked straight to Lila's table, the way a man might walk to a podium. "Lila," he said, and his voice was too tight and clipped to be any kind of kindness. "I need to talk to you. It's urgent." She looked up, surprise flaring and then setting into something firmer. Evan glanced between them, good smile faltering as he read the room. "I'm in a meeting," Lila said, cool and professional in a way that distance demands. "I don't care," Beckett said, the words out without the filter of the man Lila deserved. He flicked a glance at Evan he was immediately ashamed of, an assessment he had no right to make. "This can't wait." The possessiveness in his tone snapped across the table like a wet towel. Lila's surprise hardened into fury so pure and quiet it burned. In that flash of a moment, she saw something ugly under all his good intentions. His panic had borrowed the posture of control. She had left such postures behind. "How dare you?" she said, her voice low and steady, the most dangerous kind of rage. "How dare you walk in here like this? You sound exactly like him." She didn't say Cole's name. She didn't need to. The comparison landed like a blade. Beckett recoiled as if struck. He let himself fall into Evan's vacated chair like he needed to sit down to be allowed to breathe. "You're right," he said, the words rough and honest. "I was jealous, and I made an ass of myself. I'm sorry." He lifted his eyes to hers. He looked wretched and human, and a little boy who had broken a precious thing and wanted to glue it back together even though he knew glue would show. "I saw you laughing," he confessed. And this time the word didn't sound like something he thought he was owed. It sounded like a miracle he didn't think he'd see again. "And I panicked." "Your panic doesn't give you control over me," she said, but some of the wind had gone out of her sails at the raw way he'd said it. "I know." He scrubbed his hands over his face. "I know words aren't enough for you anymore. They aren't enough for me either. I need to show you. I need to prove I trust you, that I'm not the person you fear." He fell silent then, mind racing like the engine of his car before it sputtered out in Maple Bridge. There had to be something that wasn't a gift wrapped in guilt, something that wasn't grand for grandeur's sake. He thought of the conversations they'd had about books and belonging and the tight smile Lila always wore when she talked about the town's old clock tower that everyone sighed over and no one could afford to fix. He thought about the way her face lit when she talked about opening a bookshop cafe one day, a place where stories could breathe and people could sit with them longer than a cup of coffee lasts. He sat there, the idea arriving in his head like a comet. It was ridiculous. It was impulsive. It was exactly the right kind of impossible. He didn't text the next day. He knocked on her door. When she opened it, wary and braced for impact, he handed her an oversized envelope that felt heavy just to look at. "What is this?" she asked, suspicion doing overhead stretches. "An apology," he said. "The only kind I know how to make that will mean anything." She opened it on her little kitchen counter with a butter knife because of course she couldn't find the scissors. She slid out the papers, read them twice, and then looked up at him with her mouth open. "This is the deed," she said, "to the old Harrington clock tower building." For years it had sat in the center of Maple Bridge like an old tooth everyone agreed they should pull and no one could afford to. "Beckett," she stammered, shaking her head. "I can't. This is insane. I can't accept this." "I know," he said, his hands up, palms open in a gesture that tried to communicate that this wasn't a trap. "And I'm not asking you to accept it as a gift. Don't think of it that way. Think of it as a challenge, a starting line. The building is bones right now. It needs a heartbeat. It needs a dream. He breathed out a laugh that had no humor in it. "I'm betting you have the courage and vision to give it one, to build the bookstore you talked about. Not because you need me, because you were always going to. I want the chance to stand beside you and say I believed in you when it was hard." She stared at the deed, at her name typed clean across the bottom. Lila Hart. Her name had never looked like that, next to something that mattered. She imagined the clock tower living again, ringing hours into the sky. She imagined shelves and light and the smell of espresso. She imagined her town having a place where they could linger and belong. It made her breath go thin. Her chin tipped up. "This is manipulation," she said, but the accusation didn't land with the old bite. It sounded like someone too astonished to scold. "Is it?" he asked gently. "Or is it faith? I'm not asking for anything in return. The building is yours. You could sell it tomorrow and never talk to me again. But I don't think you will. I think you're a builder. I'm just giving you something to build with." Lila looked at him and heard him. He wasn't trying to buy his way back into her life with a shiny lie. He was tossing a rope across the chasm he had created and asking her if she wanted to grab it. Pride warred with longing. Fear stepped aside for a second. She nodded so small you could have missed it if you had been looking at your phone. She accepted. Reality, the finest buzzkill, introduced itself immediately. The building was gorgeous on the outside and chaos on the inside, the way old things get when they're unloved long enough. It needed new plumbing and updated electrical and a dozen structural repairs that cost more than nice words. It needed inventory and equipment, policies, and people. Lila, who organized her spice rack alphabetically and liked her calendars on paper, spent nights hunched over her laptop making a business plan so meticulous you could have performed surgery on it. The numbers lined up side by side like enemies about to duel. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. The deed had put her on a starting line. The finish line was on the far side of a financial canyon. She dressed in a blazer that made her feel like she could do hard things and walked into the Riverton First Bank with her plan printed on paper so thick it made a sound. The loan officer, Mr. Pendleton, had a smile he probably thought of as kind, and that people like Lila recognized as condescending. He read her application. His eyes rattled off her life like bullet points. Librarian, single, no collateral except a derelict building she'd been gifted. His smile tightened like a belt one notch too far. "It's a lovely idea, Ms. Hart," he said kindly, which is often how men wrap bad news they've already decided on. "A real credit to the community. But the numbers. I'm afraid the risk is too high. We can't approve this." The rejection stung, and then flared into anger so clean it almost tasted sweet on her tongue. She gathered her papers with shaking hands she wished would stop shaking before he noticed. She was about to stand when the door opened and changed the weather. Beckett walked in, not like a knight with a checkbook, but like a man who had borrowed his own gravity to make sure she didn't drift alone into space. He didn't look at Pendleton, he looked at Lila and sat down beside her. And in that instant, the atmosphere in the tiny office shifted from dismissal to stakes. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, voice smooth as dipped steel. "I'm here regarding Miss Hart's application." Pendleton's eyes widened as he realized who had just walked into his office. "Mr. Vale, I had no idea you—" "I'm not involved," Beckett said coolly. "This is Miss Hart's project, entirely. However," he added, the word a filament that made the room hum, "I'm here to offer my services as co-signer and personal guarantor for the loan." He turned his head just enough to meet Pendleton's gaze and held it. "And my legal team at Vale Dominion would be happy to review the agreement to ensure the terms you're offering a promising new local business are fair and equitable." The threat wasn't a threat so much as a reminder. Power can be used without crushing anyone. Pendleton began sweating like the radiator in an old car. He shuffled papers with an urgency that had been missing when Lila had walked in alone. "Of course. We may have been too hasty. Let me revisit your projections here." Lila sat very still and watched it unfold. He hadn't swept in to save her, to pity her or claim the project as his own. He had done something better, something rarer. He stood beside her and made the world take her seriously. He leveraged his name, not like a weapon, but like a shield. That was the day she understood what it looked like when a man like Beckett Vale fought for you without taking anything away from you. Not with money dropped like crumbs for birds. With weight, with intentionality. Her loan was approved on terms she hadn't thought existed. She signed with a pen whose weight she felt in her bones. Construction began, and with it came a new kind of beautiful noise. The old Harrington clock tower woke up. Hammers sang mornings into being, saws whirred, voices overlapped in the language of work. Lila stood in the doorway in a hard hat that made her laugh at herself and gave orders to men twice her size without embarrassment. She was no longer just the librarian who shushed. She was the person making things happen. She had opinions about tile and sconces, budgets and back-ordered fixtures. She came alive. Through it all, Beckett kept his promise. He showed up in jeans so worn they made him look anonymous, and in sneakers that had seen mud. He knew how to wield power. He was learning how to wield a paint roller. He didn't interfere. He didn't insert himself unless asked. He did what needed doing, showing up with coffee and donuts for the crew at insane o'clock, hauling boxes like a man who'd never lifted anything more delicate than thin glass. He learned to spackle without leaving obvious scars. He spent an entire Saturday on a ladder gently cleaning the tower's clock face as if he were touching a sleeping child, his brow furrowed in concentration, dust turning his hair gray at the temples. He reveled in the ache at the end of the day, the honest soreness that no yoga class had ever given him. Lila watched him laugh with Hank and mourn a dropped box of mugs, and dance with a broom to a Motown song when he thought no one was watching. The mistrust that had stuck in her chest like a splinter began to work its way out, sanded by weekends and drywall dust and the smell of stain. They found things during the renovation, little time capsules of the town's long, ordinary life. A marble hidden behind a baseboard that they named Marble and kept on the counter. A black and white photo of a woman in the 1940s sweeping that very floor, her hair pinned and her smile real. But then, one afternoon spent tearing down a false wall, Lila found a tin tucked deep and out of sight. Inside were letters, delicate and faint as dried leaves. They were written by her grandmother, Ada Hart, who had once dreamed of opening a bookshop in Maplebridge when she was young and the town was poorer. Her application for a town grant had been denied by a group of men she named, men whose last names now hung over law offices and a park bench. The letters were full of hope and exhaustion, resilience and longing. Lila sat on the floor with her back against a beam and read until the sun slanted. She cried quietly, not because of the sadness, but because of the feeling that someone had saved a breadcrumb trail for her to find. Family secrets don't always involve scandal. Sometimes they're quiet generational dreams that took the long way home. She showed Beckett the letters, and he held her hand like he understood what it meant that her blood had wanted this before she did, that her grandmother had knocked on a door that had stayed shut. Lila was going to open it with both hands and leave it open behind her. They were covered in plaster dust one afternoon, assembling a bookshelf that had more parts than a rational piece of furniture ever needed, when Cole appeared in the doorway like a bad draft, cooling everything. He took in the scene, the clock face gleaming, the light across the floor, the work, and sneered. "Seriously, Lila? You're playing house?" His smile was a familiar small cruelty. "You think a guy like that," his chin jerked at Beckett, "is going to stick around? He's having his little small-town experiment before he gets bored and goes back to his real life. You're a pit stop, sweetheart, at best." The words were designed to aim straight at the tenderest part of her heart. Before Lila could even open her mouth, Beckett set his screwdriver down with care, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked over with tired honesty written across his face. He wasn't angry. He was done in a way Cole would never understand. He put an arm around Lila's shoulders, not to claim, but to steady. "You've got it wrong," he said. The quiet in his voice was heavier than a shout. He looked at Cole and then at the chaos and beauty around them. He looked at Lila the way a thirsty person looks at water. "I'm not visiting her world. I'm trying like hell to belong to it." Cole didn't have anything to say to that, because you don't argue with truth when it's that simple. He left in a huff that looked silly now that all his power had no audience. Lila exhaled. The last threads of doubt that had wrapped around her lungs slackened. Opening night felt like magic you could touch. The clock tower didn't just stand, it presided. Juniper and ink books and cafe glowed from the tall windows like a lighthouse. The doors opened, and Maplebridge walked in with curiosity and love. The town's old heartbeat had returned and found a new rhythm. Inside, shelves rose like avenues lined with spines. Lamps threw warm pools of light across tables where people settled like they were on a couch at home. The espresso machine hissed and then purred, and somewhere a guitar played a song you didn't know you knew the words to. Lila moved through it all like light, an arrow of joy. She hugged Mr. Fenn and showed a teenager where the fantasy section had moved, and helped a woman pick a mystery the woman would love so much she would stay up too late and be late for work. Pride radiated off Lila in waves, so palpable you could warm your hands by it. This was hers. Every decision visible, every compromise invisible, every corner welcoming because she had made it so. True to his word and his promise to hold space, Beckett stayed along the edges. He wasn't the benefactor or the brand. He was Lila's boyfriend, a presence that looked like home even from across the room. He watched her glow. He watched her build a thing people loved. The admiration in his chest swelled so big he had to roll his shoulders to make room for it. He understood then, down into the marrow of himself, the gift of standing in someone's corner while they stood center stage. Later, when the initial rush calmed and the baristas, kids who'd cut their teeth in the copper cup, found their new rhythm, Maya found Beckett tucked into the poetry section as if Adrian Rich might whisper directions to him. "She's incredible, isn't she?" Maya asked, knowing the answer and asking anyway, so he had to speak it into the world. "She's everything," he said simply. His eyes didn't leave Lila, which told Maya more than any elaboration could have. "You know she's terrified, right?" Maya said, lower now, without drama but with the precision of a person who makes a career of telling truth in ways people can use. "Terrified of what? Look at this place. She did it." He swept a hand around, fond and astonished. "She isn't afraid of failing. She's afraid of you leaving." Maya waited, and he didn't say anything because he hadn't thought of that exact fear, hadn't honored its size. "The cafe is open now. The dream is built. In her mind, the reason for you to be here in Maplebridge is done. She thinks you'll miss the rush and go back to your penthouse and your boardrooms and your kind of air. She thinks she's your intermission." The words hit him in the sternum, hard enough to make him reach out and steady himself with a hand on a shelf. He had been so focused on building the bones of trust that he had neglected the muscle that needed to keep beating. He didn't want to be a visitor in her world. He wanted a mailbox here. He wanted a library card in his wallet with a crease in it. He needed to show her, not whispered on a sidewalk, publicly, unmistakably. He looked up at the makeshift stage near the front where a local kid had been playing folk songs earlier, his guitar case open for tips and compliments. The idea arrived, fully formed and terrifying. He walked to the stage before he could talk himself out of it. "Excuse me," he said into the microphone, and the sound startled him, his own voice filling a room that wasn't a hotel ballroom or a conference center. Conversations died like candles. "Could I have your attention for a moment?" He introduced himself as simply as a man like him could. Every face in the room turned. Lila's eyes found him. Surprise flared there, and then something like apprehension, and he wanted to be careful with that, like it was glass. "Most of you don't know me," he began. "But of course, some did, the magazines having made sure of that. If you do, it's for a world I was born into. A world of numbers and buildings and complicated yeses. He didn't apologize for it. He named it. He let his eyes roam over the space Lila had created, the honeyed wood, the threads of conversation, the clock hands, patient and wise. Over these months, this place, his voice went softer like someone stepping into a church, has taught me that success isn't measured by height or by the decimal places in your quarterly reports. It's measured by whether a place makes people feel more like themselves when they leave than when they entered. No one has taught me that more than Lila Hart." He looked at her then, finding her gaze and holding it like a person holds a railing when they're about to cross a swinging bridge. He didn't blink. "I didn't help build this," he said, and his voice warmed on the way the truth fell out. "Lila built this and me. I forgot what it felt like to belong to a community until I watched her make one." He could have stopped. He didn't. He announced the first initiative of a philanthropic foundation he'd been too scared to start, because giving away money carefully is harder than holding on to it. The Vale Hearth Initiative would fund small-town entrepreneurs who had dreams big enough to embarrass them and plans good enough to work. He pledged a number that made people gasp and glance at each other to make sure they'd heard right. And then he said the line he'd come up there to say. This program was inspired by one person's vision. I can think of no one better to sit on its board and help us find other dreamers like her than Lila Hart. A wave of sound went through the room. Surprised laughter and murmurs, and little choked-off noises people make when they've just seen something better than they thought people were capable of. Beckett set the microphone down and stepped off the stage and moved through the room like a man walking toward the only person in a crowd that mattered. He stopped in front of Lila, and the world narrowed to the two of them again. I don't want to be a visitor in your world, he said softly. He leaned in as if to keep the words just between them, even though everyone in the room wanted to hear them, and half the room was trying to. I want to live in it with you. The speech had been for the town, the public legitimacy of her work, the way he could move a needle with his name for good. The whisper had been for the place inside her that still flinched. It was the ultimate answer to the question she had not dared to ask. Do you love the building, or do you love me? The answer was the easiest he'd ever said. Life found a new lighted path, and they walked it together. Beckett didn't just show up on weekends anymore. He bought a small house on the edge of Maple Bridge. Unremarkable if you weren't the person hungering for exactly that. The house had white trim in need of paint and a kitchen that held on to warmth after the oven was turned off. It had a little garden out back next to a narrow stream where frogs made ridiculous noises at night. He still ran Vale Dominion, but more and more, he did it from a desk in a room where an old clock from the tower hung on the wall. He found that power traveled fine over Wi-Fi. So did humility. Lila, freed from the fight to be believed, flourished. She ran Juniper and Ink with a confidence she had once mistaken for arrogance when she saw it in other people, and now understood was simply loving what you love out loud. She chaired the board of the Vale Hearth Initiative, her empathy and clear-eyed practicality making the program better than it would have been if Beckett had filled it with the same kind of men who sent him decks with too many buzzwords. The line between his world and her world blurred beautifully until it was simply theirs. One golden afternoon in late spring, he told her to wear shoes she could walk in, and they drove out of town with a basket in the back seat and no explanation. He pulled off on a narrow country road and led her into a meadow blanketed in wildflowers that looked like someone had poured a paint box on the earth. The sound of bees sang around them like whispering prayers. They spread a blanket and ate chicken salad sandwiches and cherries and talked about nothing and everything with their shoulders touching. The sky arched blue enough to break your heart. Beckett reached into the basket and pulled out an old book. Not a book, but a journal, bound in worn leather, smooth with years of someone else's hands. Found this at Mr. Fenn's, he said, eyes glancing to hers and away again, as if he were trying to hide a surprise behind a smaller surprise. Thought you might like it. Lila took it, felt the weight of it, the way objects that have outlasted other challenges seem to hum with permission. She opened it. The pages were blank and thick and creamy, luxurious blankness, except for the first page. Only 6 words written in Beckett's elegant, impatient handwriting. Chapter 1. The Day I Knocked. She looked up, her heart climbing up into her throat, and he was already easing down on one knee in the flowers. Grass stain be damned. I've spent my entire life reading and investing in other people's stories, he said. His voice thickened, cracked, found its way. But the only story I want to write now is ours. Every page, messy and honest and sometimes coffee-stained. Every chapter from this one to our last. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a ring that took her back decades. A vintage setting, simple and delicate. A clean diamond that caught the afternoon sun and scattered pieces of it across his knuckles. Lila Hart, he said, his voice trembling, which made her love him more. My best friend. My partner. My favorite story. Will you marry me and help me fill these pages? 2 years later, Maple Bridge woke on a sun-drenched Saturday that felt like a postcard written by the town to its future. Juniper and Ink wasn't a new venture anymore. It was a place where kids did homework and old men played chess without keeping score, where first dates turned into regular Mondays, where tourists took pictures and locals rolled their eyes and then smiled. The old Harrington clock tower chimed the hours, and the sound stitched a seam through the day that made everything else make sense. Lila, 6 months pregnant and radiant in a way that made the baristas hover too much, moved through the cafe with the slow grace of someone who knows everyone in the room by name and can laugh while remembering where every copy of Little Women is at any given minute. Beckett arrived after the lunch rush and slid into his usual seat, not because it was marked or reserved, but because every time he sat there, he could see the entire room and the way Lila owned every square foot of it, without owning anyone inside it. He wasn't a visitor anymore, he was a Maple Bridge man, less in where he slept and more in what he cared about. He'd traded an address with a doorman for a home that needed the gutters cleaned. He'd traded tailored suits for sweaters that grew softer with each wash. Board meetings in rooms with too much air conditioning for video calls where the sound of frogs drifted in the window, and someone on the line inevitably said, "You live somewhere that has the audacity to have frogs?" And he'd grin because audacity sounded like peace now. A manuscript from First Light, the small imprint Vale Dominion had launched to publish voices Juniper and Ink discovered, rested unread in his lap. He watched Lila recommend a book to Mrs. Klein, who'd been coming to the cafe since it was a construction site, and who now took her coffee with extra foam and all the town gossip. He watched Maya wipe down a counter, and he watched Lila absent-mindedly rest her hand on her belly and smile at something the baby had done, a habit that made him press his lips together so the feeling in his throat wouldn't spill out all over the floor. After closing that night, the lights in the front were turned low enough that the books glowed like a city at night out the window. Lila propped her feet on a stool and rested her head on Beckett's shoulder. "Had a call with Evan today," she murmured, warm and sleepy. "His book's coming out with First Light this fall. He told me to tell you thank you." "He should thank you," Beckett said, his hand finding the place where her dress stretched and stopping there like a pilgrim kneeling. "You were the one who saw his early mess and told him it was a story worth cleaning up. You were the one who handed him a platform," she said, counting softly, unwilling to let him minimize his part in their plan to change the parts of the world they could reach. "Partnerships are made of better arguments." He smiled and pressed his lips to the top of her head, where the baby hairs did what they wanted. "Speaking of platforms," he said, "I also got a call today from Cole." Lila tensed, not dramatically, just enough to make him feel it. She hadn't seen or heard from her ex since the day Beckett had waited him out on the construction site without raising his voice. What did he want? She made her tone neutral on purpose. He wouldn't get the satisfaction of knowing he could still throw her off her axis. "A job," Beckett said, the disbelief in his voice too wry to hide completely. His company folded. He was surprisingly humble, said he had been following the Vale Hearth initiative and was impressed by the way the program honored people's dreams. He paused. He asked if we had an entry-level opening, and what did you say? Lila turned to look at him, eyes curious but braced. Old ghosts that had been exorcised sometimes still rattled chains out of habit. "I told him we weren't hiring." He kept his face careful, unkindness not his style, vengeance never as satisfying in real life as in films. But I had HR send him a link to the small business grant application. He met her gaze without flinching. "I told him if he had a good idea, he should apply like anyone else. I told him the board, which you chair, makes all the final decisions, that his future is, quite literally, in your hands." Lila stared at him a long second that felt like standing on a cliff looking down at water you once almost drowned in. Then she smiled. It wasn't triumph. It was relief and a thing that tasted like closure, lit on a match and burned to a sweet smoke. "Well played, Mr. Vale." "I learned from the best, Mrs. Vale," he said, eyes twinkling, because his life's best decisions had been when he'd learned from her. He stood and pulled her up carefully. She pretended to protest, and he pretended it made a difference. He put his hands on her belly, and the baby kicked, a small thrum that made his breath catch like he'd been run through with joy. "Our next chapter is eager," he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers, fingers spread wide against the little universe between them.
"She has her mother's spirit," Lila said, and Beckett laughed quietly, because agreeing was a kind of worship. He looked around the dim cafe, at the rows of stories waiting patiently to be picked and lifted into the light. He looked at his wife, the word not new anymore, and still as surprising as a sun-warm stone in your pocket. He looked at the life they had built from a mistake that had turned out to be the sanest thing either of them had ever done. "I used to think my life was a finished book," he said softly, as if confessing to the titles on the nearest shelf. "A slick story with an empty ending." He pulled her in, the motion as easy as breathing. "You didn't give me a chapter, Lila. You gave me a whole new book." He closed his eyes and listened to the clock tower's late-night chime as it unspooled the hour into the town like a blessing. "And I cannot wait," he said, voice thick with gratitude and the kind of love that doesn't need to perform to believe itself, "to see how we write the rest of it." She put her arms around his neck and felt, finally and completely, the peace she had wanted since she was a girl reading late under her covers with a flashlight. "Whatever it is," she whispered, "I know it will end happy." Not because life always does, but because we will write it that way as much as we can. They stood together in the place they had built, a room made of light and paper and patience. The clock on the wall ticking like a promise, and in that ordinary, extraordinary quiet, they knew their happy ending wasn't a line that waited for them. It was the work they did every day. It was the way they chose each other. It was the sound of Maple Bridge breathing, the bell breathing, the baby breathing someday. The wildflowers in the vase on the counter, picked from the same kind of field where he proposed, tilted their heads toward the light that had always been there, just waiting for the right hands to pull back the curtains and let it in.